Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Dean Jobb, his book, A Gentleman and a Thief, historical true crime. Absolutely love this book. Been talking to Dean for like a year on Twitter. You know, he just reached out. We had a great conversation. He said, I have a new book coming up. Finally, we got to do this recording. The book is about to come out. It's fantastic. Just a great vibe on this guy. You're going to hear he's a guy you want to hang out with, have a chat with. And luckily, I got to do that. And how about I shut up and let you hear it? And here we are with author Dean Jobb, A Gentleman and a Thief, the daring jewel heist of a jazz age rogue. Dean, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you, Brendan, for having me on.
Dean, I'm so excited this is actually happening. We've basically just been talking to each other on Twitter. I'm not going to call it X. Twitter for like a year. This feels like a big deal, like I'm finally meeting a friend of mine.
Well, thanks. I guess I'm a bit of a history nerd myself, so I was taken by the name of the podcast, and I like your interest in true crime.
Well, let's get right to it. Arthur Barry, he's this rogue that we're talking about. How did you even first come across him?
I've done some 2 or 3 previous true crime books, one of them in the jazz age. In research, I find smaller stories, but I was deliberately looking for my next book. I was coming off the case of the murderous Dr. Cream, about a Victorian-era serial killer, and looking for my next project. And I can't believe this worked, but I typed the words 1920s con artist into Google. And one of the early hits was a Life magazine profile of Arthur Barry from the 50s, described him as the greatest jewel thief who ever lived. Now I thought, well, this might be overstating the case, but I read the profile, which gave me the gist of the story, the outline, and it was fantastic. I mean, he was just what I was looking for, just this roguish, daring, masterful thief who, I like to say, robbed from the rich and gave to himself.
Well, what I find funny is that is not the first time that an author has told me, how'd you figure out your next book? And they went, Google and Wikipedia. I'm starting to wonder how authors did it back in the day when those two things didn't exist. Did they have to just sit in a library and start going through newspapers?
Well, yes. And of course, it is the speed now with something like newspapers.com. You know, it's hard to find something that has the legs for a book. That's every author's biggest fear. You know, you think, wow, it's a great story, and you sort of get wedded to it. But, you know, is there enough there? And then that's where the history comes in for me. I write historical true crime, so I want there to be something about the times. I want there to be a reflection of the times, which will help me build the world for the reader, so I can place a great character like Barry in his times. And I mean, he epitomizes his times. He's a high living, they called him Broadway plungers. He plunged into the nightlife and the speakeasy scene. One of the reasons he had to become so good at stealing jewels is he needed the money because he was basically a gambling addict who would blow the fortunes he was making from theft and have to go out and do it again to make it up.
Historical true crime being so different from true crime. Because I know just being a reviewer, very often I'll see for a historical true crime book a bad review where it says they were just talking about other stuff that wasn't the criminal. And I always find that it's a kind of a misconception that if you're doing good historical true crime, as you said, you have to talk about the era. If you're doing true crime right now, you don't have to explain what it's like to be here right now. You're there. Whereas with historical true crime, you can't just start talking about what Arthur did without understanding what the jazz age was like, what his life would have been like, and the way, honestly, people kind of thought about things back then, right?
No, that's a good point. I don't want to leave the impression that I'm writing a book like this that, you know, has a little bit of true crime and it's a history book. True crime is the theme, the through line. But along the way, you have to understand, as you said, the times. You have to understand the excesses and the obscene wealth of the jazz age as reflected in F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. I mean, The Great Gatsby is fiction, but it's set on real places, real mansions in Nassau County, Long Island. And this was exactly where Arthur Barry targeted most of his most lucrative heists. I just think it's a matter of saying, you know, it's almost, come for the true crime, but stay for a bit of history, you know, and learn about the era as well. And, you know, in a sense, the era of Arthur Barry, cat burglar, second story man who could slip in and out of bedrooms undetected is not going to be replicated today in the same way. Not with sophisticated alarms, security cameras, motion detectors, and gated communities and things like that. So you do have to, I think, place the story and the characters in their times to fully understand what was going on, and in Arthur's case, to fully appreciate how he mastered his chosen profession.
I love how you open this book and set the stage, because it opens up with Barry basically ingratiating himself with a very, very, very famous person that I'm going to let you talk about. But I love that setup, and it's got to feel like a godsend as an author, where you sit there and you say, I can explain how good this guy is with this one little moment or one little evening, and just show you how masterful he is. Can you tell me a little bit about that evening that starts out the book?
Well, when you start a book, where do you start it? Where's the best entry point? And you're right. I could not think of any other logical or better way to start it than in 1924, where Barry, who one of his MOs was to put a tux on, jump over the fence and get into an estate and just start mingling in a garden party, grabbing a cocktail on his way through and passing himself off as an invited guest. And where he did this brazen act, and this is where he was such a good con man as well as a burglar, was at a reception for the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, who was visiting Long Island in 1924, was being feted at all the multimillionaires' mansions. And he's there to sneak upstairs at some point, wander off, and case the joint, find out where the jewels are likely to be when the hostesses have gone to bed and taken their jewels off, open some windows if they're locked so he can come back and easily get in. But he bumps into the Prince of Wales and starts chatting, and somebody's saying, it'd be nice if we could get away. The Prince of Wales is quite itchy to enjoy a little freedom because he's so constrained by his royal duties. And Barry says, look, I'll show you around Midtown Manhattan. We'll go to some speakeasies, and they do. And it's incredible to think that he was so slick. I mean, he was a working class Irish boy from the wrong side of the tracks in Worcester, Massachusetts. But boy, he could pass himself off as a dapper heir of some multimillionaire, and that's what he did.
I think a lot of people go back and say, we'll ask the question, was Barry bad from the beginning? Was he, set up to just be this way? But as you said, he comes from a working class family. It's not like he was brought up in crime. He came from one of those families that, for the most part, was not the type that was going to set him up to be a master criminal later in life, right?
No, he was from a very strict Irish Catholic family. His father worked in some of the breweries in Worcester and other businesses. But Barry got into trouble early, and he often said his downfall was he wasn't a huge man by any means when he was an adult, but he reached adult size quite early. So he was bigger than his peers. He started hanging around with older boys and started to get into scrapes, minor crimes, petty theft. But then he picked up an unusual gig for a teenager looking for an entrepot de crime. He became a courier for a safecracker who was retired, but in his retirement was distilling homemade nitroglycerin for other safecrackers. So Barry became his courier. He'd pay him $5, which was a lot, to take a padded suitcase with nitroglycerin in it on a train to his customers. And there's a great scene Barry recalls where, he wasn't quite sure what this was, but the guy said, well, just be careful, don't bump into anyone. And then as an afterthought, and make sure you don't drop it. So that was his start. He wasn't arrested for that, but he did some break-ins. He ended up in reformatory, and his life almost got back on track thanks to the First World War, because he was sent overseas. He was a first aid man, they called it, a medic, and showed incredible heroism in the battlefield, was wounded, was gassed, carried many men to safety who might have died, was recommended for a medal. Despite all that war record, he also was held behind for a year, part of forces occupying Germany. So when he shows up in New York, late 1919, all the jobs are gone by earlier waves of veterans. He didn't know what to do with himself, and he had done some break-ins and been pretty good at it. And he basically weighed his options and said, I don't want to be a bank robber. I don't want to have shootouts. I don't want to have accomplices. What am I good at? Sneaking into houses and stealing things. And that's exactly the deliberation he made, just like he was at a job fair. And then he just got better and better at it and refined his methods.
Kind of the perfect encapsulation of Barry's entire personality. As you talked about World War I, he was up for the Distinguished Service Cross.
Yeah.
One of the highest awards, and then didn't get it because he was messing around and decided to go AWOL for a little while. Not even like permanently AWOL, just wanted to go have some fun. And I can't think of a better way once, when I finish the book, I'm like, it's all right there that he's not all evil. There's good things about him and he has some good instincts and he will take care of people. But at the same time, he cannot get out of his own way. And he has, I wouldn't call it a mean streak, but a bad streak. And World War I just kind of lays that all out right away. And the rest of his life is already kind of set up from there.
One of the things that drew me to him was he's the kind of anti-hero you can root for. He wasn't inherently a violent man. He never hurt anybody he robbed, but some people were held up in their bedrooms, their privacy, their sense of security was shattered, but he never physically hurt anyone. In fact, he tried for years. His MO was he would break in while the family was downstairs dining, and he would very quietly go through the bedrooms and find jewels. But he found more and more that if the people weren't at home in bed, the jewels weren't there. They might be at a party or downstairs or whatever. So he started to get more brazen and he would break in and try not to wake people, but he's rummaging around their bedrooms. And when he did, he would always put their minds at ease. No, look, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just here for the jewels, relax. And in the press, it was like this gentleman bandit who had this rapport with his victims almost. But that was Barry. I think that shows that, he could have just stuck a revolver in people's faces. He could have fired it, whatever he could have done. He actually was in more jeopardy than his victims because he was often shot at or pursued and had to navigate guard dogs and things and watchmen. I think fundamentally the biggest reason he was this guy you could root for is he's stealing jewelry. And I make the point in the book, it's hard to think of something that's more the flaunting of wealth than jewelry. I mean, you can have a mansion and it can be way more than you need, but you can live in it. You can have a Ferrari, which isn't a basic car, but at least you can drive it. But all you can do with jewelry is show it off. Somehow we can root for him because he's stealing something that really doesn't hurt the victims. He even rationalized, and he said most of them have insurance. And he said most of them are going to claim these jewels were worth a lot more than they really were. In other words, they're even maybe going to profit. It's not truly a victimless crime. One of the ways he rationalized it was just like Cary Grant's character in To Catch a Thief. 20 years before that movie appeared, Arthur Berry said, any woman who can walk around with $750,000 pearl necklace doesn't have to worry where their next meal's coming from. And Cary Grant's character says, whatever I did, I never stole from anyone who'd go hungry. So it was just an interesting juxtaposition. So it made it easier to like the guy on a number of levels.
And now, as an author, do you also have to worry about liking him too much to make sure that you don't completely lionize somebody who is a criminal? We've talked about that there's a lot more people that are much worse than he is. But at the same time, as an author, you got to sit there, right, and say, well, I got to make sure I kind of give the full picture here and not just like, he's a wonderful rogue. We can all root for him while he steals and robs and things like that.
Well, I'm a stickler for accuracy, so those nuances are there. The truth is, as I said, he never accosted any of his victims. He did recruit an accomplice who was a hothead, and that became an untenable sort of partnership. One that actually, in later interviews, Barry played down. One of my challenges was to set the record straight on that and some other things, that he wasn't purely a lone wolf. Barry was easy in the sense that there's other times where he demonstrates as the story unfolds. He's gentlemanly in terms of taking the fall to prevent his wife from being charged as an accomplice at numerous times. And then his later life, he goes on to become a respected citizen after he served his time, without getting too much into the details of where the story goes. But there's a consistency here that made it a little bit easier. I did like the guy. I liked a lot about him, but I also tried to, show the flaws, and there were some flaws.
So we don't have to worry about you falling so in love with him that you're going to get caught being a jewel thief in the next few months, right, Dean? You got to tell us it's not going to happen.
Well, I do know a lot about how to break into people's houses and steal their jewels. I mean, Barry gave several interviews, and he was asked about, and he explained his methods. Two things stood out. One was, don't put your jewels in the top right-hand drawer of your bureau, because he said 9 times out of 10, that's where he found them. And so someone said, well, if I have jewels, where should I put them? So a skilled burglar like you won't find them. And he said, hide them in your kitchen. Okay, well, there's advice for people who might be worried that I'm casing their mansions right now.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna be able to go right back to you if we read the book. Something else about, and you somewhat mentioned it, is that a lot of times he'd decide who he was going to steal from because people were wearing jewels and pictures in the newspaper. You have a corollary to social media right now. If you go on social media with this gigantic necklace, people might start looking and say, oh, that'd be something good to steal. He used a lot of that to be able to say, oh, here's my list. I'm just going to go through the Times and kind of see who's on my list for the next few weeks.
I made that point that, celebrities showing their bling on social media are just, making themselves targets. Well, in the 1920s, Barry said the social pages of the New York papers were his unwitting accomplices. They told him where rich people were, where they lived, when they were in Palm Springs, when they were home. There'd be pictures of women bejeweled. One police detective in New York threw up his hands, and because, there were a lot of other jewel thieves operating, not just Barry. And some of them quite violent, hold-up men and, shootouts. Basically, in frustration, this detective said, well, what do you expect, when women are parading around like the window in a pawn shop, covered with jewels? There was an element of flashiness. And it helped him target. He claimed he memorized the Social Register. Now, the Social Register isn't a book we'd know about today, but at the time, you were in the Social Register, you'd made it. It was like the phone book for rich people. This is where he would get ideas of who was wealthy, who was big on Wall Street, who was a big industrialist. He would get connections so he could sound like he knew people, because when he starts chit-chatting at parties, nobody's quite sure who Dr. Gibson, which is what he called himself at one point, weren't sure who he was, but he seemed to know everybody, which put everybody at ease. One other trick he had was he'd hang out around lunch spots where the socialites would go. If he saw women with particularly attractive jewelry, he'd follow them out, see what car, what limo they got in. Then he'd call a police station claiming to be a cop on the beat, saying, hey, a car with this license plate just involved in a hit and run. Can you tell me, so I want to track down who it is? And they would tell him, thinking he was a policeman. And apparently he used that several times and got tens of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry, because what the police inadvertently were doing was telling him where the people lived, so he could go case their mansions.
It's amazing how disciplined he was, going back to him almost being two different people, and that he's so disciplined to take the time, right? Because we're talking about these robberies, and like you said, he didn't just, oh, that's the house, I'm going in right now. He'd case the joint. He'd go in there for a party and then not take the jewels right away. Like, he had this amazing discipline, but at the same time, apparently, he could not stay away from the gambling tables and keep his money. So we always had to keep stealing. It's like two people in one. It's truly amazing with this guy.
He said he had more of an urge to gamble than sex. Gambling was like at the forefront of what he wanted to do. I compared him to Nathan Detroit, the character in Guys and Dolls, this Damon Runyon-esque plunger, they called him, the plunge into the nightlife of Broadway. He would win tens of thousands of dollars on the roll of a dice. He'd lose tens of thousands. And when the money ran out, he'd have to do more jobs. But you're right, there's such a recklessness in that. But he's also a product of his generation. That's where the Times come in. He was asked later, did you ever put any away? Is there buried treasure somewhere, stuff you didn't fence? And he said no. And he said, I wish I'd kept it. He said, but you have to understand the times. A whole generation have been scarred by war, the revolution of youth, the liberation of women, flappers, speakeasies, the flouting of prohibition. I mean, it was an anything goes decade. And he said, those were the times. Why not live well? And so he wonderfully reflected what we see in The Great Gatsby, the carelessness and the opulence and the wealth and the live for today attitude. I mean, he personified it and lived it.
A little bit more of a history lesson. Can you tell the listeners about Raffles? It comes up quite a few times. Can you explain what that is and what that refers to?
Well, Raffles is an iconic character, little known today. In fact, Barry had never heard of him and had to go look up books. A writer named Hornung, who was brother-in-law of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was married to Conan Doyle's sister, created this character was A.J. Raffles. And he was this gentleman, but a gentleman thief. he didn't exactly have a heart of gold. He very openly stole because he wanted to maintain his lifestyle as a gentleman. He was a champion cricketer. I mean, he was just part of his British. It was set in London. And he was this debonair, top-hatted, walking stick carrying man. And at night, he would break into Bond Street Jewelers or wherever he could. He had a few scruples. One was, if you're staying in a country home, the other guests are fair game. You want to steal their jewelry, but it's not quite cricket to steal from the host. So, he's this sort of interesting mix of rogue and gentleman. The Raffles stories were starting to be in early movies and things. The newspapers started calling this mysterious thief, who they didn't know was Barry yet, the Long Island Raffles, or Raffles Strikes Again. But that was the character. And listeners may know of a sort of a version of Raffles, which is Arsène Lupin. And the Netflix series Lupin, set in contemporary Paris, of a gentleman jewel thief, is actually based on a series of novels about the turn of the 20th century, about this Lupin, this gentleman thief in Paris, that was sort of set up as a crime-solving criminal version of Sherlock Holmes, or counterpoint to Sherlock Holmes, building on the Raffles character.
He's a lot like it is with pirates, right? Like, pirates are very popular, and they might try and be colored a certain way, but they are outlaws. But there's a romance to pirates, especially, nowadays, that kind of looks at these criminals but puts them in a way that are palatable to people, to readers, that they can enjoy them being outlaws.
Yeah, and I mean, Barry's a crook. Barry's an outlaw. He steals, and he's rightly going to get his comeuppance. But there is something to the rogue part of his personality. I mean, he pulled off spectacular heists. I'm a true crime writer. I don't embellish anything. And I made sure I've got a source for everything in this book, because some of what he did is unbelievable. But you go back and you look at the news coverage, and yeah, I mean, he was described like a human fly. One paper said, Hollywood's missing a stuntman, someone who could get in and out of this place like that. And he stymied private detectives on his tail. Chief of detectives named Harold King in Nassau County. I mean, basically made it his mission to try to catch this mysterious burglar. And of course, that was great for storytelling, because I was able to tell his story, because every thief needs a pursuer. And that made it a little bit more like Catch Me If You Can.
And it probably helps around this time, too, when we're talking about jazz age opulences. Very often the cops are somewhat in on it, or easy to buy off. I mean, this all comes down to Barry got very good advice early on, which was to always be a gentleman, always be polite. And he stuck to that. If you're talking to the cops, if you're talking to anybody, be polite. You're going to get away with a lot more than you normally would if you're going to be combative, right?
Well, fast forward, I've kind of suggested that he's a fugitive at one point, even after he's been outed. In one of the apartment buildings where he lived, there were several police officers in the building that he had a nodding acquaintance with, and none of them realized he was this arch criminal being sought. I mean, no, he seemed to have a way to ingratiate himself with everyone. I mean, he became a friend of Harry Houdini and his wife. He became a friend of Jimmy Hines, a big Tammany Hall political boss of the time. He ingratiated himself with the future King of England. He had this con man's charm, and I think some of that was natural, I just like to think of him as a guy who found his groove, and it just happened to be a criminal groove. And I think you can admire that about him, even if you say he's still a crook. He was a darn good crook, And if you're going to be good at something, well, why not aspire, I guess? As I said, Life magazine called him the greatest jewel thief who ever lived. I don't know if that's saying too much, but, he certainly deserves to be in the upper echelon of brazen, successful burglars in history.
And another gift you get from his life story, because like you said, it's almost unbelievable. He has a real love story, like a soulmate type love story. How does he meet Anna Blake? How does that all come to be?
One of the challenges I knew I'd have writing the book was making Anna Blake a character. Yes, she's recently widowed. He meets her through the Tammany Hall. Jimmy Hines, she's a district captain in the Democratic Party's Tammany Hall. So she is like part social worker, part political worker, part helpmate to constituents in the area. If someone's struggling, helping them out with accommodation. If someone loses a job, helping them find a job. Someone struggling with language, trying to, navigate for them. So she was extremely interesting, but in anything Barry said about her, he was highly protective of her, to the point where I interviewed young nieces who were at the time Barry lived till 1981. And so some of his who were young nephews and nieces back then remembered him well, and he remembered him as this kindly Uncle Art. And they were shocked. They didn't know he was ever married. But he did get married in 1925, and Anna Blake believed him when he said he was a salesman. Obviously wasn't a salesman, and he had a lot of money, but he said, well, he was good at gambling, only a half lie. And she thought, well, she was recently widowed. He swept her off her feet. He was devoted to her. She said, I didn't care what he did. But in 1927, they're both arrested. And she's in jeopardy of going to prison as an accomplice, even though she swore, and he swore, she had no idea what he did. He made the mistake of giving her a ring. It wasn't worth a lot, but it was one of the ones he'd stolen, and it was identified. So he did the gentlemanly thing. He took the rap for her, confessed. They didn't prosecute her, and he went to prison. So, yeah, there were these elements of a love story. But the thing I didn't expect, again, that I would be able to get into such detail, is I discovered a multi-part syndicated series she had done telling her life story. Remember the headline, My Life of Love and Fear with the World's Greatest Jewel Thief, something like that. And in these pages, and this is in the 30s, so it's not long after events happened, she gave in detail their life on the run, her shock at discovering what he really did, how he swept her off feet. So I was able to infuse this with this really tender love story that then starts driving the plot from then on.
Is it a lot easier as an author to write about people like Arthur and Anna who have their foibles? There are problems here. There's criminality. But you can look at them and you can say, I see good things about them. Whereas like your last book, Dr. Cream, was just a terrible human being. Is it easier to write about people that you like? Or is it the book is the book and the path is the path, and sometimes even a complete villain can be easy to write about? Or does it feel differently when your subjects are so different?
I teach in an MFA program in nonfiction writing, and I tell my students, when you're pitching a book or you're thinking of doing a book, it's a long-term relationship. And my relationship with this serial killer you mentioned, Dr. Thomas Neal Cream, I'd call that toxic. Yeah, he was an odious character who killed at least 10 people in 3 countries. And my story in that case, or my focus in that case, was kind of an obvious question. How did he get along with it for so long? Which led to a lot of insights into the Victorian era, the Gilded Age, into the privilege a professional doctor got, into the horrible plight of women, especially young women who had unwanted pregnancies, and the misogyny of the Victorian era. I suppose the saving grace was, as terrible as Cream was, I did want to understand both him and how he got away with it. But I was really happy to be able to write his eventual demise. And I was ready, like anyone who's emerging from a bad relationship. I guess I was looking for something on the rebound that would be different. So I had done a book before Cream on a Chicago Ponzi schemer from the 20s, Leo Kortz, whose story was not known, who said he had fantastic wealth in oil fields in Panama, which were distant enough that his investors didn't realize till they went down there that there was no such thing. So his was this great story of gullibility and greed and lots of humor. So I was ready. Yeah, I was ready for, as I said, some kind of an anti-hero, I think. And I also was taken by the fact that burglars, jewel thieves, they don't often have this much of a story, that can support the sort of breadth of the story. A decade after decade, there's still stuff happening to him. It was luck to find him, but then to see, as I did more research, just the possibilities. And yeah, he was a lot more fun to hang out with for a while. That's for sure.
All right, if I can send you back in time and you can talk to one character from the book. Arthur is off the table. I'm not letting you talk to Arthur. It's too easy. Who would you want to talk to, sit down for an hour and ask some questions of?
Oh, I think it'd be Anna Blake. As I said, I was really happy with the way I was able to make her a full character and to understand, she was a modern woman. Women were suddenly not dabbling in politics. They had the vote. They were active in politics. Politicians were courting their votes. So I think I understand a lot about her, but I would like to ask the question that I couldn't fully answer. Did you have some inkling that something was going on here? After you found out, when you thought back, did you say, oh, now I know why I drove such an expensive car. Now I know about that bankroll I saw that time. So I curiosity. I mean, there's lots of questions I'd have for, the police and things like that as well. But yeah, I suppose you put me on the spot, and that would be a good question, because I believe her. But I would like just to test that, because she sticks by him. I mean, obviously they had an incredible bond, incredible relationship, because even though he shattered her world and goes to prison, she's 100% behind him. I don't think that was guilt because she was in on it or anything like that. I think it speaks incredibly about their relationship and what a strong woman she was.
Dean, there are these horribly misguided people who think that anything with history in it is boring. Right? It's a class they took in high school. They don't ever want to have to do it again. It's boring. If I sat one of these poor people in front of you and they said, why should I read A Gentleman and a Thief? What would you say?
Storytelling. I did some academic work when I was in university. History was my focus. You can dissect history as a study, as a theory, or you can tell engaging stories. And history gets a bad rap because everyone thinks, well, it's just remembering a string of dates and a bunch of names. And unfortunately, it can be. But you can also, it's really up to the writer to up your game and say, well, but how can I bring this to life? And I don't want people to be, told what happened to Arthur Berry. I want to show them. So I want to recreate scenes, and not embellish scenes, not make up scenes, but just looking at the material, being able to craft the party scene where he meets the Prince of Wales. I've got enough accounts of what went on. I've got enough either press accounts of the event or memories of what happened that I can come up with the story of what happened there and recreate that for readers and draw them in. So I would say to that person, there's lots of great history. Read David Grann, read Eric Larson, writers that I read who bring history to life. And I think they'll be happily surprised and glad they came along for the ride.
Well, Dean, I absolutely loved it. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about it.
Thank you, Brendan.
And that's it for this episode. Dean, thank you so much. A Gentleman and a Thief. Go out and get it, everybody. Absolutely loved it. Hit us up, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Check out the YouTube. Let Mike Barnett know how he's doing. Let us know how we're all doing. Email us. Hit us up wherever you can find us. Thank you for listening. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.